Okay, so just so you know, I started the video and got interrupted, so I'm going to walk you through what I had done before. So we're going to be doing rational expressions. Rational expressions are fractions that have a polynomial on the top and a polynomial on the bottom. So we're going to go over how to simplify this kind of fraction. So the first step when you're simplifying these is to factor. So that's what I was in the middle of doing. So my numerator, I notice, is a sum of cubes. So I can use my SOAP to factor it out. And then my denominator is one that I'm going to do by grouping. So I'm going to group the 3b to the third minus 2b squared together. And I'm going to put a plus sign because that negative has to stay with the 3. When I look at the first set of parentheses, I notice that I can take out a b squared and I'm left with 3b minus 2. Over here in the second one, I can take out the negative, and in taking out the negative, it'll turn the 3 positive and make the 2 negative. So now I notice that I have this shared polynomial, so 3b minus 2, and what's left when I cross it out is b squared minus, and we have to remember to put a 1 there as our placeholder. So in looking what I have now, I notice that I can actually factor b squared minus 1. That's a difference of squares. So I'll have 3b minus 2 and b plus 1 and b minus 1. So all of this right here is just for the denominator, with this being the final denominator. So I'm going to just rewrite this so that it's a little bit cleaner and all together. Fully factored, your fraction is now this. So your first step on any of these is to factor. If you'd rather do your factoring work over to the side, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay, after we've factored, so your step 2 is going to be to reduce. So when we go to reduce, we're looking for polynomials that are exactly the same on top and bottom. So on the top I have a b plus 1, and on the bottom I have a b plus 1. So I can cross those off and reduce them. I don't have anything else in common, so that means I can now move on to step 3. Step 3 would be to simplify anything that's left. So my final answer, b squared minus b plus 1 over 3b minus 2 times b minus 1. Sometimes after reducing you might be able to do some more, but on this one, for simplifying, it's as simple as just copying it over without the parts you crossed off. So these are the 3 steps that we're going to follow when we're doing our simplifying on this next assignment. So we're going to go through, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 more examples to make sure we've got this. So our next one, actually I should say number 1, c plus 3 squared minus c plus 2 squared all over 4c squared plus 20c, make that a bigger 0, 20c plus 25. So I'm going to start with factoring. So on top, I notice that I have a difference of squares because I have a perfect square here and a perfect square here. So if I take the first term plus my second term, that'll go in my first parentheses. I'm going to use brackets instead of parentheses here. And then in my second parentheses, I'll have c plus 3 minus, and then parentheses c plus 2. So there's my numerator factored. My denominator, I'm going to do my trinomial factoring. So I'll put my two parentheses, and I'm going to list out my factors until I find one that works. So I started with 2c and 2c, because that will give me 4c squared. 25, positive 5, positive 5. 10 plus 10 is 20, so we're good with our denominator. So before I go on to the reducing part, I do want to try to simplify my two brackets up here so that I can more easily see something that I might be able to reduce. So in my first bracket, I can combine like terms by adding c plus c and 3 plus 2. In my second parentheses, I have to distribute this negative. So that's going to turn the c negative and the 2 negative and the sign in the middle to a plus sign. So c plus negative c will give me 0, and then 3 and negative 2 will give me a 1. And then this is still over our 2c plus 5 squared. So I just combined the 2c plus 5 times 2c plus 5 to 2c plus 5 squared. So now when we go to reduce this, the 1 we don't even really need to write, but I can cancel out one 2c plus 5 with one of them on the denominator, leaving me with a 1 on top and then one 2c plus 5 left on the bottom. That's as far as I can go, so that would be my final answer. Okay, so when it's just one polynomial on top and one polynomial on the bottom, we can just factor and simplify like we did on these first two. The next one that we're going to go over is actually multiplying and dividing of rational expressions, which follows the same 3 steps as the simplifying. So on this next one, we're going to be multiplying and dividing rational expressions. So we have 5x plus 5y over 3x minus 27y times 7x plus 7y over x minus y divided by 28x squared minus 28y squared over 27y minus 3x. So here we have 3 rational expressions that are being combined by multiplying and dividing. So just like in the simplifying, we start by factoring each polynomial. So 5x plus 5y, I can factor out a 5. In the denominator, 3x minus 27y, I can factor out a GCF of 3. On top of the next one, the 7x plus 7y, I can factor out a GCF of 7. The denominator can't be factored any further. It's already as simple as it gets. And now when we divide fractions, if you remember, we change it to multiplication and we flip the fraction. So this 27y minus 3x is going to come to the numerator. So when I factor it, I'm going to factor out a negative 3 here, and I'll explain why I do negative 3 here in a second. And that'll give me x minus 9y. And the reason I went and did the negative with it is because I noticed that over here it was x first and 9y second, and if I didn't take out the negative, I wouldn't have a matching polynomial. So I took out the negative because I was aware of this denominator over here. So then for my numerator, which now is my denominator, I can take out the GCF of 28, and I have x squared minus y squared. And then I notice this is a difference of squares, so I'm going to instead write x plus y, x minus y, so that I have it fully factored. Once you have it fully factored, now we get to reduce. And when we reduce with multiplication, we can also cross-cancel just like other fractions. So if it's something in the denominator, it cancels with any of these in the numerator. So this x minus 9y in the denominator, that'll cancel with x minus 9y in the numerator at the end. For x plus y, it'll cancel with the x plus y that's down here. Let's see, then we can also look at the numbers. This 3 can cancel the 3 here. The negative 1 will still be there. The 7 can cancel with the 28, leaving us with a 4. And I think that's all I notice right now that can cancel. So I'm going to look to see what I have not crossed off on top. So on top I have a 5, as well as an x plus y, as well as a negative. So I have to keep that negative up there. On the bottom I have an x minus y, and I have a 4, and I have another x minus y, so I'm going to put an x minus y squared. Nothing is in common, so I am done. Okay, so the first part of your assignment is going to be looking at simplifying and then as well as multiplying and dividing. It then is going to move into adding and subtracting rational expressions. So if we have something like this, so now we're adding and subtracting, which means we don't have cross-canceling available to us. We have to think like we do with fractions back when we first learned them. In order to add these or subtract these, in this case, we have to have a common denominator. So that's going to be our first, one of the things we have to do before we can combine these is get a common denominator. So to help us find a common denominator, so just like before, we're gonna, in the ones before, we're gonna start with factoring. We're gonna factor the denominator, just the denominators. We don't need to factor the numerators, just the denominator. So let's see, on this first one, I don't really see anything I can factor. I could move it around by factoring out a negative, but that's really the only kind of factoring we can do. On the second one, so again, I'm not going to worry about factoring my numerator. I'm just going to leave it as 6 minus 18a. I'm going to set up my 2 parentheses, and when I factor, I'll get 2a and 3a minus 5 minus 1. Negative 2 on the outer, negative 15 on the inner gives me my negative 17. Okay, so you might wonder, how do you know when to take out the negative like I did here and when not to? If you want, you can actually do this one first to know if you're going to need to take the negative out. So in this case, by taking the negative out, I see that I have a piece that already matches. Because what we're going to be looking for next is the least common denominator. And in finding the least common denominator, we have to look at what each denominator already has and then fill in what's missing. So this denominator already has a negative and a 2a minus 5. Now this one has a 2a minus 5 and a 3a minus 1. So they both already have a 2a minus 5, so we have to then fill in what's missing. So this first one is missing the 3a minus 1, so I need to multiply by 3a minus 1 on the top and the bottom so that I can get the common denominator, negative parentheses 2a minus 5 parentheses 3a minus 1. Now on this one over here, the only thing that's missing is the negative. So that means I'm going to multiply top and bottom by negative 1. So I'm going to have now on the denominator negative 2a minus 5 and 3a minus 1. Okay, so our denominators are good, so all that we have left is we have to now multiply our numerators. So 5 will get multiplied into 3a minus 1, and that'll give us 15a minus 5. Over here, we're going to make everything opposite of what it already was. And now that we have a common denominator, we can add the numerators. So step 3, add or subtract the fractions. So again, in adding and subtracting fractions, we've already got the denominator, so I'm just going to copy that down. And I'm going to add my numerator. So 15a minus 5 minus, and so because this is in the numerator, I want to make sure it's in parentheses. And I'm doing that because I have to remember to distribute this negative or this minus sign to everything in the numerator. So I'll have 15a minus 5 plus 6 minus 18a all over negative 2a minus 5, 3a minus 1. And so again, the last step here would be to simplify on top if you can. So 15 minus 18 is negative 3a plus 1. And we still have our denominator. And one of the things you do want to check here, so I guess I should add to my steps real quick. So 4 is to simplify. And our last part of simplifying is going to be to see if top and bottom, if anything, cancels. So see if you can factor again to make your new fraction as reduced as possible. So one of the things I notice is I have on top the exact opposite of the denominator. So if I were to take out a negative from the top, it'll turn it into 3a minus 1. And now I can cancel the 3a minus 1s, and I can even cancel my 2 negatives because I now have 2 negatives, which will make a positive, giving me a final answer of 1 over 2a minus 5. So you might be wondering, how do you know when you're done? You know you're done when you have one fraction, and when that fraction has nothing in common, the numerator and denominator have nothing in common, so you can't factor and reduce. If you can't do that, you know you're done. So if we couldn't reduce this here, we would have stopped there. The only reason we had to go further is because we did have something that could reduce on top and bottom. Okay, we're going to do one more adding and subtracting before we call it a day for notes on this section. So let's see, let's flip the page, and again, if you need more time to copy, hit pause. So number 4 here This will be our last example, and we'll do another adding and subtracting. So just like before, we're going to start by factoring just the denominator. So if I look at my first denominator, I can factor that to be a plus b times a minus b. And the other denominator, I can do my double bubble, a, b, b, and they would both have to be negative so that they still multiply to b squared, but when I add them together, I get -1 and -1 to give me -2. So now I'm going to look to see what is my least common denominator. So they both already have an a minus b. This one actually has two a minus b's, so I have to account for both of them. So this has two a minus b's. This has one, which we already have, and it also has an a plus b. So now we have to figure out what do we need to multiply the numerator and, whoops, that should be a minus. To make sure our fractions match. So this first one, it had the a plus b, it had one of the a minus b's, so that means we have to multiply top and bottom by another a minus b to get it to become our common denominator. On the second fraction, it already had the two a minus b's, so that means we had to multiply by a plus b on top and bottom to get our common denominator. So when I multiply or distribute the 3 through, I'll get 3a minus 3b. Over here I'll get 5a plus 5b. So next, now that I have the common denominator, I can now add my numerators. So on top, I'll have 3a minus 3b plus 5a plus 5b. And on the bottom, I have my common denominator, a minus b squared times a plus b. So again, I'm going to simplify what's on top. So 3a and 5a will give me 8a. Negative 3b and 5b will give me plus 2b. And one of the things I am going to check is if I were to factor the numerator. So if I were to take out a 2, does it match anything that will allow me to cancel? So after factoring out the top, the 2 from the top, it still didn't match anything. So that means this here can be my final answer. So when you are done simplifying, you always want to just check. Can I factor it so that something cancels? If you do it and nothing cancels, this is your final answer. If you factor it and something can cancel, then you have to keep reducing until it's as simple as possible. So with this set of notes, because it's during class that you're listening to them or watching them, if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll come around to answer it for you, as opposed to doing it as a whole class. So just raise your hand if you have a question on any of your notes so that I can come around and help you out before you get started on your problem set. If you don't have any questions, just go ahead and start the 1-3 at the bottom of these notes.